Good evening. You're watching Asian Review, and I'm David Day. Joining us this evening for our program is Mr. Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategy Policy Institute from Canberra, Australia. Peter, nice to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having me on.
And we've also been able to coerce into joining us on this program Mr. Garrett Grace, a local Hawaii businessman, but formerly with the Australian Navy. And Garrett, nice to have you again.
Good to see you both. Good.
And ladies and gentlemen, what we want to talk about this afternoon and what we want to find some answers to are to really take advantage of the background and the expertise that both Peter and Garrett have inside the Australian perspective, the Australian state of mind on some issues that are very important to Americans here in the Pacific. And I guess the first one that I want to talk about, and the reason that we should talk about this is, before I get to the issue, is I think it's important because we as Americans, we tend to get buried in the forest too much. We can't see the forest but for the trees, and it's nice to have the valued insight and advice and perspective from a trusted, valued, extremely loyal ally. And this is one of the weaknesses that I think we as Americans need to change out. We need to listen to what our allies' perspectives are and what they're really saying. And so with kind of that as a background, let's turn first of all to the big issue here in the Pacific for most Americans, and that's the so-called pivot or rebalance. And maybe Peter, for our audience, if you can help explain to the audience what the American policy, what that pivot is supposed to be all about.
Yes. Well, David, I think it's really been driven by a sense of the world's centre of economic gravity moving to Asia. And that's the product of the enormous growth which has taken place in the Chinese economy, but not solely the Chinese economy, in Southeast Asia and South Asia as well. And really from that, I think, flows a higher level of strategic priority needs to be accorded to the Asia-Pacific region. So if the US, for the first 50 or so years after the Second World War, thought of itself as a sort of an Atlantic power, I think increasingly America thinks of itself as a Pacific power. Economic and strategic factors are driving the US to have to pay more attention to this part of the world. And really from that flows the thought that the US needs to rebalance its military engagement, perhaps away from Europe to some extent, and into closer defence engagement in the Asia-Pacific.
Well, Peter, a lot of Americans in the national defense, national security, foreign policy fields, when I ask them about this pivot or this rebalance, and I say, well, you know, I really don't see much of a shift here. They say, well, wait a minute now. The pivot is more about military and defense. There's this whole other side, this cultural side, this mindset. What's your response to that?
I think that, well, the military side has probably led for a number of years, and in some respects I think what we've seen is the State Department and others playing catch-up and saying that the pivot really also applies to economic policy and to other areas of US engagement in the region. But it's only going to be seen to be believable, I think, in the region if the Americans underpin the pivot with real military priority. You know, for the Japanese, for many in Southeast Asia, and for the Australians for that matter, I think that in fact the pivot will be believable if we see that backed up with real changes in military priorities.
So Peter, are you saying the pivot today is not believable in Australia?
I think the pivot is on pause is how I would describe it in terms of American priority. I mean, I personally take the view, I think President Obama gets it. I think he understands the region and understands the purpose of it. But because of events in the Middle East, that has perhaps slowed down some of the factors driving it. In the Australian context, we have the movement of Marines, a small element of Marines to the north of our country, and that's valuable and something that Australia strongly supports. But in terms of those big movements of ships and aircraft numbers, well, we really haven't seen so much of that quite yet.
Garrett, what's your take on this?
Well,
From you got to wear your Australian hat for a moment.
But it's been talked a lot by the administration, the State Department, but so many audiences in Asia really are not sure what it means, what the long run implications are. So I'd like to hear about that. Why have the State Department, et cetera, had such a time explaining and getting through what it all really means and what it means in the not now, but in 10 years' time, 20 years' time for the future?
Well, but why? I understand your question, but why do you raise that question? Is there a feeling that the State Department is trying to sell something that nobody else is buying yet? Is that what you're really saying?
I think I would say, yeah, that's one way to put it. Yeah.
Peter, what's your...
Well, I think in a military sense, which is really my area, I think that events in the Middle East just keep, unfortunately, getting in the way of the sort of clarity of Washington's plans, if I can put it that way. It's very hard in a military sense to talk about significantly repositioning a large part of the US Navy until such time as we see American military commitments in the Middle East significantly wound down. And those factors just keep getting in the way of that.
But are we really talking about the overall military? Because the Navy, for sure, with the submarine force, etc., and also the Marine Corps, have been heavily focused on the Pacific since World War II, through Vietnam and all of that. Is the Army probably more so, would you say? Or?
Well, you know, in the case of the Marines, they're only just beginning to get back to a point where their forces based in the Pacific have been taken away from Afghanistan operations. So the 25th Division based here in Hawaii, for example. And increasingly we now see that reorientation to collaboration with friends and allies in the Asia Pacific is taking place. I think part of the reason for the pause, David, is that you know, we also had a change out of senior administration officials after the election, and so we've seen both in defence and in state almost a sort of a complete shuffling of the deck in terms of senior officials.
On the American side.
On the American side. And perhaps a new crowd that's not as sort of instinctively supportive of the idea of the pivot, as was the case under Clinton and Panetta. And I think there's also been a bit of an interagency wrangle over, well, should the military lead? Should there be other areas of priority which is, should lead in terms of Pacific policy? And really what this is just, and then of course I add to that the impact of sequestration, the fact that the administration has been so internally focused in Washington, not really thinking about foreign policy beyond crisis management. I think all of these things have really led to a sense of doubt in some places in the Asia Pacific that there is actually something of momentum coming off the pivot.
Peter, has it helped or hurt with the John Kerry's focus now apparently on the Middle East peace process? It seems like it's a complete misdirection of what we would have thought would be in the focus, which was this rebalance.
Well, certainly something that's been noticed in the region is that John Kerry has not been as present in the Asia Pacific as might have been expected. His visits have tended to be short. There have been occasions where, for example, when President Obama was due to visit Bali in Indonesia for the APEC summit, he was unable to come because of sort of understandable domestic problems in Washington due to sequestration. But from a diplomatic point of view, I'm afraid it's true. This does undermine the credibility of American diplomacy in the region. As you would both know, it's a region where face time is very important and where the presence of senior officials is enormously valued. And so when they don't come to senior meetings, that is unfortunately seen to damage the US cause.
I mean, the reality of what you're saying, Peter, is that with this kind of ongoing implosion, if you will, of peace in the Middle East, from problem after problem, country after country, that the State Department and Washington, if you're gonna operate on a crisis management basis, you're not going to be able to do anything serious in the Asia Pacific region unless you designate or deputize some other senior leader to work the problem, and clearly we haven't seen that here. You know, the attempt to have Vice President Biden visit both Japan and China right after the ADIZ was imposed by China, boy, that was a bomb.
Well, you're right, of course, and of course we don't want necessarily the sort of crises in the Asia Pacific which would force immediate administration attention into the region. So there's a bit of a challenge. You know, how do you manage American long-term interest in the Asia Pacific when in fact the short-term keeps diverting you to Syria or to Iran or to the Middle East peace process? I think one answer to that, and you know, something that I've put to US official colleagues over many years, is the need for the administration to actually express what its strategic intent is for the Asia Pacific through a policy statement like an East Asia strategy, which was the sort of thing that we saw actually come out of the Pentagon in the 80s and 90s.
Okay.
And we haven't actually seen for almost 15 years or so. Now, I understand in the first term of the Obama administration, there was an attempt to actually produce a document like this, and it just sort of fell away due to interagency wrangles.
Oh, was that right?
And in fact, the challenge now is, you know, to produce a piece of work like that is a complex interdepartmental challenge, and I just think that there's been, frankly, a lack of reluctance to actually go down that track again.
Is it reluctance, or they just simply don't have that Asian A-team and focus, to be able to focus on something like that?
It's taken the administration a long time to fill those positions. I think the people that are in those jobs now certainly have the capacity to do it, but really the question is that where the priority effort is going to be over the next few years? You know, you look at the Pentagon and you see that the key focus there is coping with the impact of significant cuts.
Yes.
To say nothing of winding up, you know, a complex and lengthy war in Afghanistan. I think that's where the policy attention is really being spent.
You know, Garrett, Peter's perspective and view on this whole issue of the pivot is that it's on pause and considerable doubt among the allies and neighbors in Asia. I think that kind of sums up your position. What is your position on the pivot? How do you see it?
I mean, I look at it obviously from the local perspective, Hawaii, how it affects Hawaii. It's going to mean some repositioning of troops, Marines. That's very important to Hawaii when that all shakes out. So as that does get off the pause and starts to move forward, we'll probably see some of those impacts here locally. And hopefully from a positive perspective of, you know, infrastructure and whatever, as we bring some of those assets to Hawaii with the whole rebalance.
Okay,
so I look at it from that perspective rather than that bigger picture Asia perspective.
Do you see the pivot or the rebalance today as being on pause, or do you see it some other way? There's different nuance than Peter's perspective?
Again, I think my focus is mainly on the apparent misunderstanding, or at least where Asian audiences don't necessarily get what has been talked about and spoken about over such a long period of time. And it's frankly interesting that a group like the State Department has not been of get the message out in a clear enough way that it would be accepted by audiences. But it'll take obviously more effort.
Let me get the kind of the reactions of both of you on the response that we so often hear that no, don't look at the military side. That's only a small piece of the pivot. That it's really the economic side, that the shift. That's where all the focus is. And so, as a private sector business person, I hear this and I say, okay, yeah, well, that's true. There's more business in the Asia Pacific region than there is in Atlantic, and so forth and so on. That makes sense. But I don't see, other than the attempt to kind of pin the tail on the donkey, which is the TPP, I don't see any other action on the economic side that lends credibility to that argument. What's your reaction to that?
Look, I guess you could say, David, that on the economic front, the pivot works in spite of Washington, not because of Washington. I mean, it's working because economic forces just drive attention to that part of it.
Okay. And that's not unusual. I mean, that's for no matter what the administration is, it tends to be that business tends to get done despite, even though we know that there is a big effort to help it export and some of the other trade, but really it tends to get done despite Washington.
You know, on that profound note, we're going to take a commercial break here. And when we come back after the break, what we want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is we want to probe these two gentlemen about what their perspectives are on China's next move here in the Asia-Pacific region. I'm David Day. You're watching Asia in Review. I'll see you on the other side of the break. We're back. You're watching Asia in Review. I'm David Day, and we are here looking into Australia's perspectives on a whole series of issues here in the Asia-Pacific region. And with us in this program, in case you just joined us, is Mr. Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategy Policy Institute from Canberra. Nice to have you with us, Peter, for those who just rejoined the program.
Thanks, Simon.
And we can't talk about Australia unless we've got Garrett Grace, who's Garrett is a local Hawaii businessman and also a former member of the Australian Navy. Can I use the word member? Is that okay?
That's perfectly fine.
I like the word member. You know, that indicates that
I've been called worse things.
Okay. All right. Let's, before the break, we were talking about the perspectives, Australia, Asia perspectives on the pivot or rebalance to Asia. Let's shift to a different topic now. Let's look into what do you really think going to be the next move that China is going to make in the region? We've seen the imposition of this air defense identification zone, ADIZ, in the East China Sea, and the policy planners in Beijing got to be just wildly enthusiastic about the success of that. You saw some fabulous U.S. interagency cross-firing and misfiring back and forth that gave this plan a lot more solidity or solidarity than they in their wildest imagination could have foreseen. And then we've seen just recently that Hainan Island has imposed a what I call a FDIZ, a fishing defense identification zone over the whole South China Sea. So, what do you think, Peter? What's next?
Well, David, in both those things, I think what you're seeing is quite a conscious Chinese strategy to sort of incrementally push the boundaries of how far it can go to extend its own sovereign authority in its maritime approaches, both in the North China Sea and in the South. And if this is a correct interpretation, I guess what that really means is that every step that China can take where its control is expanded and that is not protested about too strongly by China's neighbours, that's seen to be a success in Beijing.
All right, let me stop and interrupt you right there. Is that because what's happened is over time the U.S. has not done a good enough job in establishing red lines. In other words, we don't really have red lines coming out of Washington on very many topics anymore. They're more like they've kind of faded. They're kind of what I call pink lines. And so because China doesn't really know where the red line is, they're testing, they're pushing to see how far they can go. I mean, is that a possibility?
I think that is part of the Chinese strategy, and of course the challenge for the US and for Japan and other countries is if you draw a red line, you should be prepared
stick by it. That's right.
Defend it. And where do those lines exist? Well, I think in some sense they exist over the Senkaku Islands, where the US says that they fall under the administrative control of Japan. In other respects, and particularly in the South China Sea, there is, I think, less clear questions about, how far the US should go, really to, impose its own authority into an area where, for example, America has no claims or really doesn't take any sides as to what those different territorial disputes are. And so I think that 2014, 2015 is really going to be a threshold time where the US has to conclude for itself just how far it wants to go in drawing some red lines.
Well, that's the home stretch of the current administration in Washington, and probably from a Chinese perspective, I mean, they've got to see lame duck or weakness there. I mean, Garrett, what do you think?
Well, I mean, how much is bluff? I mean, they've been able to get away with a lot internationally, both by using the economic clout. Obviously, they're our biggest lender, so they've got a lot of economic clout with us. But a number of the things that they've done have been pushing, probing, but they haven't really crossed the line, other than maybe that old P3 incident back in the George W. Bush days. If you remember when it got really serious at that point. So I'd expect they'll continue to do that type of thing, but a full overt attack on, say, Taiwan, I think things like that are off the table. They've got too much going within on their economy and building their own internal economy to get into a real shooting war with the United States. So I don't think they'll cross that line.
I'd agree with that. I think one thing to watch for is, will we see an air defence investigation zone declared in the South China Sea? That would seem to be the next logical step after the one which has been created. Now that would be more of a problem, and I think does present a serious risk for Washington and for the ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries, should that happen.
What difference does it make? I mean, they have an ADIZ overlapping the Japan and the Korea ADIZs in the East China Sea. How would the South China Sea be any different?
Well, it would be another step towards saying that China has effective sovereign control over the South China Sea.
Turning it into a lake, basically, a Chinese lake.
That would be something that would, I think, absolutely galvanise the countries of Southeast Asia.
You're saying that would not go down smoothly with the Vietnamese or the Filipinos?
It would not go down smoothly with anyone, but it presents a challenge for Washington, which is, well, how far do we now wish to sort of invest ourselves into what, up until now, has really been a problem along the Southeast Asian.
Well, let's come back to this concept of the red line, pink line.
Yeah.
Do you think the U.S. has really established a red line that says thou shalt not lay out a ADIZ in South China Sea? Do you think the U.S. position has been that clear?
No, it hasn't. And in fact, I mean, in a sense, there's nothing wrong with ADIZs. I mean, the U.S. has some of its own.
Yeah. Australia, I'm sure, has one.
We've announced them from time to time. For example, during the Olympic Games, as a security measure, there was one around Sydney. So in a sense, you could say it's a perfectly normal thing that China might do this, but the problem it had was that it did it unilaterally without consulting any of its colleagues, any of its neighbours, and it also did it in a way which forced aircraft to identify themselves that weren't flying into Chinese territory but might have been going to other countries. Now those two things were new, and that was where they kind of got slapped back a little bit by the Americans and Australia and others, saying that this was an unacceptable form of behaviour. But really that was the limit of the US response. And I think, again, if the Chinese then tried to replicate that behaviour in the south, that would electrify the region, and all eyes would be turning to Washington to say, well, what are you going to do now?
Okay,
Peter, did you think, though, the response that was put out, was it sufficient, or is there something else that could have been done, or more that could have been done?
A response to what?
To the ADIZ.
In the East China Sea?
Yes, the original one.
The original one, yeah.
Well, I think that the US administration's diplomatic comments afterwards were about what one would expect.
Okay.
My own government made very similar noises in the same type of time frame. Then the US flew a number of aircraft through, military aircraft through the zone, and did so without advising the Chinese. Now, in a sense, I think my own view is, and I would probably support the administration's position here, is, well, you don't want to push this so far that you're creating a sort of an incident.
Yeah.
Where I think there's going to be a problem, and I think this could happen, any time soon, is we see an incident between, say, the Japanese Air Force and the PLA Air Force, or an incident involving a civil airliner, which does actually create, a serious problem, sort of a modern version of the EP3 incident of the 1990s. Yeah, and this type of sort of sharp-edged behaviour between military units, either at sea or in the air, is becoming increasingly common.
Garrett, question to you.
Sure.
China's next move, what's it going to be?
I think they're going to continue to focus on the economics. That's it. They have to. They've got some tremendous problems with their internal growth rates and their economic growth rates. So they have to keep focusing on those issues. So I don't think they move in those other ways to be more overt on the military side.
So, Peter, what about you? Do you see the possibility, or do you see a military move in the Asia-Pacific region coming?
I think we'll see more of this incremental pushing up against the red lines or the pink lines. Never quite enough to push the US into a decisive response, but always seeking to increase Chinese authority in its seas around it. It'll be doing that at the same time as it's pursuing its economic interests, and also saying to the US, well, we have a special relationship, so you shouldn't be too worried about these types of moves.
Okay, so what would that look like in this, you're talking about a kind of a salami, we call slicing a salami approach here in the South China Sea. What would that be? I mean, you've got a fishing control right now. What are they, the next move they make is they're going to register all kites being flown in the area? Or,
I think they will be
kind of commercial shipping registration?
Well, I think it will be more presence, perhaps reinforcing some of the islands on which they have, little outposts of military observers. I think at a diplomatic level, it will be pressure on the capitals of the Southeast Asian countries to basically say, look, we want to deal with this bilaterally, not multilaterally. It's everything they can do to make it look like Chinese lake, that's where their authority runs. And I think that there'll be a sort of continued pressure on that.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short commercial break at this point, and I hope that you'll stay with us and join us. When we come back after the break, we're going to look into Australia's role, perhaps as a mediator or some other enhanced diplomatic role in Northeast Asia, having to do with North Korea and with China. And we'll see you on the other side of the break. You're watching Asian Review, and I'm your host, David Day.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Horry. Thanks so much for joining us on ThinkTech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
We're back. You're watching Asian Review. I'm David Day. And with us in the studio, Mr. Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and Mr. Garrett Grace. Garrett is a former member of the Australian Navy and a Hawaii businessman here, and so he wears two hats. You know, he could wear the American hat and he can wear the Australian hat. And if you just joined the program, earlier we were talking about Australian perspectives on the pivot, the movement of Marines to Darwin, Australia, as well as, you know, kind of what's China going to do next. And in this particular segment of the program, what we want to do is kind of examine a different role for Australia, or an enhanced role for Australia as a middle power. And maybe one place to start was in the formation of the six-party talks having to do with the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, Peter. There was an initial proposal that it was going to be, what, a 6+1 or a 7, and the number 7 was going to be Australia, right?
That's right. There was for a period an Australian diplomatic effort to argue the case that we should have a seat at the table, and our diplomats were tasked with making the case of how it was that Australia was intimately involved in North Asian security. It didn't quite work. But there's no question that, you know, the Australian economy is heavily dependent on North Asia. China is our #1 market, Japan #2, South Korea is our #5 market. And so what happens in North Asia is of critical strategic interest to us. And that's reflected by a strong Australian diplomatic push to be involved with those North Asian countries.
Is there a part of that push? Is Australia trying to assume the potential role, or could it assume the potential role as a mediator in the whole denuclearization push on the peninsula, or a mediator between North and South Korea?
I'd have to say the answer to that is not really, not in a sort of a coherent or consistent way.
No, wait, don't misunderstand my question. My question is not, have they done it in the past?
Yes.
My question is, could Australia assume that role, or take on that?
I think we can play quite a substantial role. We have good and close relations with South Korea. The South Koreans themselves spend a lot of time talking about their role as a middle power. We both find ourselves as temporary members of the UN Security Council right now, and we have quite a few shared outlooks on the world. Our relations with the North, like I suppose most other countries, is pretty thin, but we have, until fairly recently, had a North Korean embassy in Canberra, and therefore we've actually had more of a channel for diplomatic engagement with the North than the US has had. So I would say that, you know, in the event of some sort of crisis on the peninsula, you know, you can assume that Australia would be there, and that we would be looking to play a constructive role post a Kim regime.
A quick question: Do you think there's going to be a war in Northeast Asia?
I think we're in danger of some serious military incidents of the type that we were discussing before the program break. Incidents at sea.
Another Chonan, another Yongpyong Island shelling type thing.
Now, my sense is I don't think there is the possibility that this could escalate very quickly into a major conventional war, say between the US and China. But on the other hand, I have not seen relations between China and Japan as bad as they currently are for probably 20 or 30 years, and that is concerning.
Let's just move a little bit up to North Korea for one particular point, and that is that in recent times, the key link between China and North Korea was kind of embodied in this Uncle Jang, who was eliminated, and we're not really sure right now precisely how he was eliminated. We just know he's gone. And so China's ability to work with North Korea has got to have been impaired by the loss of this important link. Coming back to just the Australian influence, is it possible that Australia could step into that link as between North Korea and China? play that linkage role?
That's going to be a tough gig for whichever country attempts to do it.
No, I didn't say it was going to be easy. Gig.
Oh no, well it's certainly,
I never thought it would be an easy
certainly
gig.
Not going to be
really
certainly
easy.
not going to be easy. I think that you know, we have a pretty close dialogue with the Chinese, and in fact in some respects closer than the US does on the military to military front. And North Korea has always been a topic of conversation in those meetings. I would say there is more potential to be able to shift Chinese thinking on how to deal with the North than there is any contact with the North at the moment. And sort of giving China the sense that, you know, this is its primary area of responsibility to try to act as a restraint on the behaviour of the North is something that we all need to do, Australia and the US.
Is one of Australia's assets in terms of its diplomatic firepower in Northeast Asia, is it that Australians are not Americans?
Yes, that's often a card that we can play to our success, and we do in many bilateral relationships. For example, not North Asia, but we have quite a close military relationship with Pakistan, and we're in a position to do that because we're not British and we're not American, and so you can play that card. But at the same token, of course, one of the things that makes us, one of the things that has other countries treat us seriously around the world is that we are such a close ally of the United States, and that our military, although small at a technical level and at a level of proficiency, is as good as the US. Now, we only have that situation really because of that alliance relationship with the US. So
is that a double-edged sword, though? Being so closely aligned with
it can
with
be
the US?
because it certainly you know, can be used as a talking point by other countries to put us off our guard, to say we're so close to the US that you won't take different positions on things. In point of fact, we do, and we're prepared to have, you know, fairly serious fights behind closed doors in Washington on policy
We'll get to
issues
the
that we
serious
disagree
fights
with.
behind closed doors in another section of this program, so hold that.
So, but you know, I would say if we didn't have that military relationship, we would be seen to be far less relevant. We'd be a sort of a bigger New Zealand, which New Zealand is a very worthwhile and honourable country, but it doesn't have much diplomatic throw weight, and that's partly because it's not a close ally of the United States.
And following on to that, what about the whole situation of having a foot in both camps, and how does Australia continue in the future to be so economically tied to the Chinese and so politically in defense tied to the US?
Yes. Well, this is seen by some in Australia to be a major point of debate right now, that we have our biggest economic partner in China and our closest military ally in the United States. The truth of the matter is that for, you know, 30 or 40 years we've been able to maintain precisely those two relationships. And it would be, frankly, a diplomatic and strategic disaster for Australia if either one of those relationships were broken. We have to be smart enough to sort of manage the both.
Peter, let's go back to this point that you mentioned about the terrible relationship that exists today between China and Japan over the Senkakus. You know, Australia, you just said in response to a question from Garrett that Australia has one of its feet in the China camp on the economic side because of its natural resources and so forth. Is Australia in a position to assist China and Japan with that dispute as a peace mediator, as an intermediary, to play some role in that?
I think that, frankly, the dispute is so fraught now that Australian diplomatic interventions to try to broker some type of solution would not be welcomed either in Tokyo or in Beijing. And I think they would take the view that they're, you know, big enough to manage those relationships themselves. Where I think we do add value, or try to add value at least, is in the bilateral relationships we have with each country, where we can, in a fairly frank way, talk to the Chinese and talk to the Japanese about what we think is the appropriate strategies for them to employ. And really just to kind of keep them focused on the stakes, how dangerous this situation potentially is if it leads to conflict between the two countries.
Today, is Australia playing that role in its bilateral relationship with those two countries, or are you talking about a potential that it could do in the future?
No, I think we do, and I know myself, speaking as a former defence official, I've led talks with the Chinese military over a number of years where we've actually put precisely those points on the table with our Chinese military interlocutors. So we do try to, you know, without kind of assuming a false role for ourselves, I think we try to act as a diplomatic force for good in these North Asian issues.
You know, the relationship that exists with the U.S. With America is so tight, at least from the American perspective, that I don't know, I mean, maybe Garrett, you can help me with this, but I certainly never see much in the way of daylight between the U.S. position and the Australian position on most issues of importance.
I think the big issues, there tends to be a lot of sync. It tends to be more marginal issues that will have some difference. One big issue that's coming up at the moment, I think, in the difference in Australia and the U.S. is on things like climate change. The Australians have been very proactive in that area, kind of world leaders really on it, and that is
they're doing a double reversal.
They're
now.
doing a bit of reversal at the moment, whereas the U.S. is still trying to find its way, I think, in what it wants to do. So I think it's more on these marginal issues, and then but on the big issues, you know, ever since World War I, especially on the military side, it's been very much in sync together.
Well, this concept of being on the same side, in sync, no daylight, is very helpful for the United States, very helpful for Australia, and in order to solve some of the serious problems facing the region, one of the things that I think that the United States needs is it needs a frank partner that's willing to, you know, as you say, Peter, behind closed doors maybe, talk about, you know, some positions that don't make any sense or policy changes.
It needs to be more than that. I mean, the U.S. can't be complacent either and just believe, okay, Australia's always going to be there. They need to work on that relationship as well and not forget that great ally that's out there that's been, you know, side by side in so many big issues. And that can tend to happen when you're the big dog.
Sure.
With, you know, surrounded with these smaller allies.
Well, let's do this. Let's take a commercial break here, and what we will do when we come back after the break, let's take up this topic of kind of the laundry list of advice. You know, we'll set up a hypothetical situation where Peter, you're behind closed doors and
offering free advice.
Free advice to Washington on how you guys can get your act together. And here's some things that we see that you need to work on.
Okay.
So we'll do that after the break. And ladies and gentlemen, stay with us. You're watching Asian Review. I'm David Day, and we have these fabulous guests in the studio here: Mr. Peter Jennings from Canberra and Mr. Garrett Grace here from Honolulu. Both with fabulous insights into the Australian mindset. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
We're back. You're watching Asian Review. I'm David Day, and we are talking about the Australian perspectives on a whole series of issues here in the Asia-Pacific region. And in this final segment of our program, in case you just joined us, and they haven't left me yet, so we've still got Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute from Canberra. here doing time with us here in Hawaii. And we've got Mr. Garrett Grace, a local Hawaii businessman. Thank you both for staying with us for the whole program. It's a lot better.
Aussies never leave their mates.
You guys are demonstrating the loyalty here. But in this section of the program, you know, Peter, we talked about before, it's behind closed doors that as a powerful, loyal ally of the United States that Australia can really make some changes, make some things happen in Washington. So what I want you to do is pretend like, you know, we're in the Oval Office and you're sitting there on the sofa and you're talking to the man or the woman behind that famous desk that came from the UK. Okay, don't put your feet on it, please, while you're doing that. And so what's your laundry list of advice? What does it look like?
Well, first I'd be wondering how it is that security let me in, I have to say. But look, I think the relationship is strong because we have kept our differences largely behind closed doors, and in some ways that can lead to tough but important conversations when they happen. And you know, my list would be probably firstly to say neither country should treat the relationship as though they can afford to be relaxed about it. I always get worried where I hear politicians of either country talking about family relationships and how close we are, because to me that has an air of complacency. And I've always had the view that, you know, alliances are like sharks. They have to keep moving forward in order to survive. You've always got to be thinking about the next set of activities.
You realize that's only a perspective that an Australian could describe in that manner.
In a positive way.
Yeah.
Well, maybe in Hawaii too. I don't know. And so, you know, the cooperation that we've seen in the north of the country with an increased marine presence, I think is fantastic because it actually shows that we're thinking about the next thing to do. Where I see a need for the US to perhaps steady its purpose now is an area where I think my government has made some comments to Washington already. Our Foreign Minister Julie Bishop was in Washington a week or so ago and gave a speech which I guess only the specialists would really be able to read between the lines, but a key message to the administration was to say, look, don't lose your nerve on intelligence collection following the Snowden leaks. Because I think there is a slight sense of concern that if too many concessions are made, you're going to lose what is one of the most important aspects of American national security, which is this high quality intelligence system that you have in place, of which Australia is an integral part. And I think a second point would be to say, don't lose heart on the pivot or the rebalance. Let's keep that strategic focus on the Asia Pacific because that is where America's long-term interests reside. Okay. It's not fighting ground wars in the Middle East. And that, you know, we need to be looking for more ways to actually, you know, sustain that American military presence in this part of the world. Now, they would be two areas where I think Australia would be passing those messages into Washington. And if I could venture a third, it would be on the military-to-military relationship with China. You know, Australia has actually had an unusually close relationship, military-to-military, with the PLA for 16 or 17 years.
And you personally have been involved in building that relationship, have you not?
I've certainly helped sustain it in more recent years, and now you can say the Chinese can do that with us because we're less consequential, we're not as important to them, frankly, as the US is. I think China also tends to use its military cooperation with Australia as a way of testing what might work if they apply it to the US in a later case, and I'm certain of it. So what I'd be saying, and I do say this when I'm talking to military friends here and in Washington, is you must don't give up in the effort to build those closer ties with the PLA. Because that is going to be critical to how security is managed in the Asia Pacific in coming years.
For the benefit of our audience, why do you say that the military-to-military relationship is important? Who cares?
Well, I think if there are no forms of contact, then when crises happen, when EP3 shoot-down incidents take place, how do you control those? How do you stop them from escalating into even more serious military crises? You have to have the connections there, which means that when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs picks up the phone to his Chinese counterpart, all the way down through the command chain, those types of relationships will act as a brake to the potential for military conflict. The other thing is, I think also there is a sense in which the Chinese military in particular is developing an unrealistic view about its own level of military competence.
What do you mean by that?
I think because they lack benchmarks to actually assess how effective they are. They're beginning to think that they're more capable than they really can be. And that sense of overconfidence is in part behind some of the pushing the limits that we see taking place with Japan and in the North China Sea and the South China Sea.
But as a potential adversary of ours, speaking as a US person at this point, is it better for us to allow them to have that false sense of security? Because we know they've got tremendous issues with experience and training, and they haven't done some of the major things that we have mastered in the U.S., such as carrier operations, blue water submarines, things like that.
Supply chain,
have
logistics.
Got nothing on us for that. In fact, they haven't really fought a big war in decades.
They could still spoil your day. That's the real problem, I think. And you know what I would say is think back to the bad old days of US-Soviet rivalry. You know, even at the worst point of the Cold War, there were points of connection between the American military and the Soviet military, which always kept the potential for escalation under control.
Yeah.
So I'm talking now post the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
That's what's absent, I think, in the US-China relationship right now. And I think that frankly, it's going to come from the US side as the investment of time and effort. Hawaii will play an important role because PACOM will be almost leading that military-to-military engagement. And the more the US can do in that respect, I think the better.
And on that note, thank you both for joining us here this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching Asia in Review. We've been talking about Australia's perspective on a number of issues. And Peter Jennings, thank you for coming to Hawaii. And boy, we're very blessed to have such a valuable ally and a clear thinker as you are. And Garrett, as always, wonderful to have you on the program.
You're welcome.
Thanks, David.
Good night,
Thanks,
ladies and
David.
gentlemen. Please have a safe drive home. I'll see you next Thursday night.